Welcome, everyone. I'm Mike Cahill. I want to welcome you to a next edition of Hatfield Currents, local news magazine show that's being produced by a number of people here in town. What we typically do is cover interesting events and topics and issues that are of importance to the community and information that we think it might be useful for the community to know about. The shows have ranged from historical shows to personality shows to we've done some town issue shows. We've done shows on town meeting warrants. And for those of you who have been watching, you know all about that. Today's show is a personality show. Actually a combination, a personality show and a history show. Our guest today is an archaeologist and a Hatfield resident. His name is Randy Daum. Randy's passion for years has been archaeology. He's been interested in it since he was a child. He had wanted to go to college straight after high school, but I guess couldn't afford it at the time and figured it would just be a few years until after that he could eventually go to school. But those years stretched on as life got in the way, and we all know how that can happen. Back in 2004, at the age of 40, he made his way back to college. And Randy finished his bachelor's degree in 2 years and graduated summa cum laude with departmental honors in anthropology. He then earned his master's degree in 2 more years and is now continuing his studies at UMass, pursuing his PhD. When Randy began his studies at UMass in the fall of 2006, he needed to do a research project for the Commonwealth College Honors Program. In local history books, he had read about a small settlement of around 3 homes that were built in the northern part of Hatfield back in the late 17th century. He wondered if it was still there, and he also wondered if he could find it, even though it had been abandoned for over 300 years and had been forgotten about for most of the 20th century. So this is where the discovery of something really important and interesting to all of us began. What could possibly be left of a 300-year-old village in the northern part of town after floods, weather, and 3 centuries of farming on that land? Well, I think Randy's got some answers for us today. So I want to welcome Randy Daum to Hatfield Currents. Good to have you with us.
Nice to be here.
Thank you, Randy. Thanks. Randy, before we get into this, anything else that you'd like to share with us in terms of your own personal background? Hatfield resident. How long have you been living in town?
About 15 years. 15
years. Okay, and in the northern area of town, up where the...
I had gone through a bit of a bad divorce and lost a lot, and just sort of ended up in this area, and it took a little bit, but then perhaps something to do with that big midlife crisis at age 40, but I was tired. I was involved in construction work pretty much, and so then I just decided to forgo most of that and go back to school finally.
Yeah. And we talked about all of that and how quickly that's gone for you, and you're in the process now, still in the process of,
yes, and
of going for that PhD.
Wished I started a little earlier, but better late than never. And
absolutely.
I like living in Hatfield, and I found a good research project here and a great college at UMass.
Yeah. Good. So let's talk about this this find, this village that apparently exists or existed and was originated back some 300 years ago. How did this village come to be?
Well, there was before Hatfield or Hadley was granted their land to become towns, there was a prominent citizen, his name was Daniel Dennison, that lived in the eastern part of the state here in Ipswich. And the colonial government, for various, he was a fairly upper echelon military officer for the militia, and for services to the crown, they gave him a fairly good chunk of land. And actually, this was a standard procedure the government gave a lot of the higher ups areas of
Bonuses
property.
of some sort. Yeah,
that was their
yeah.
bonus. Instead of a monetary bonus,
Yeah.
it was land. Land was
Yeah.
money then, and
Yeah.
he had gotten several chunks of land more in the eastern part of the new colony.
Yeah.
And in 1658, he was granted a section. It was to be north of Northampton somewhere, because Northampton was already settled, but of course, like I said, Hatfield and Hadley hadn't become
not
towns
been,
yet.
right.
And land in the Connecticut Valley was known to be quite valuable at the time.
Really?
I mean, it's one of the most fertile valleys in the world. It's like third. And
right.
So he picked his land. It was 500 acres that he wanted.
So you actually had the opportunity to select his location?
Him and Simon Bradstreet, who later became a governor, were both granted sections of land.
Okay.
And,
so now we're starting to hear names that are somewhat familiar with the northern end of Hatfield. Bradstreet obviously being one of them. Go ahead.
Yeah, Bradstreet got his piece of land up that way too, and Denison also picked his in the Bradstreet. In fact, they abutted the land properties abutted each other. And at the time, then Hatfield and Hadley became towns a little bit later, and their property went around that land. That land was not part of the town. It was tax exempt. It was like an island in the middle of Hadley. Hadley and Hatfield being the same town for a while there.
Right.
And,
right. Yeah.
Then.
Yeah. I think Hatfield was actually part of Hadley originally, and then Hatfield ended up ceding from Hadley, I guess.
Yeah.
In 1670.
Difficulties going to church and whatnot, to their meetings, and but Denison just kept the property. It's possible he never set foot on the property. His son visited it and staked it out for him, and I think he just kept it for investment. There wasn't anybody really using the land. He might have leased it to some area farmers, but then he died in 1682, and his heirs sold it in 1685 to a group of 7 Hatfielders, and one of them might have been living across the river in Hadley.
And at that point, Hatfield had been established.
By that time, Hatfield was
established in 1670.
Yes, and
recollection is correct. Yeah.
They bought the property, and they bought it together in like a land corporation, and then the land corporation delved out the land in little strips. They carved it up and gave everybody equal amounts of the land. And it's a very similar practice to what Hatfield and Hadley, all the towns actually did in the Connecticut Valley. They would get their land, and then they'd assign a house lot and little pieces of land in various fields around where they wanted their village to be.
Right.
So they assigned every one of those 7 men a house lot in this little town, or on this farm, which sort of became a mini version of a little town, I guess. And and some of those folks started building on their house lots. Some did not. Some of them might have leased them to others, but a few homes were built there, according to the historians. And then as I started doing some research out there, it seemed like, well, I think more than just 2 or 3 houses were out there, like Wells Hatfield history book and the Crafts history books. Both, they weren't sure how many houses were actually there. They only thought maybe there was 2 or 3 at the time. But as I started doing investigations of it, I was thinking maybe there was more than that. Yeah. And what happened? There was a lot of Indian troubles at the time with the Native Americans. There was a lot of wars, and also wars in between England and France, which they always bleeded over into the colonies for control of North America. And the Native Americans were wanting to get they wanted some of their land back. Basically, they were getting pushed off to the side, and the colonists, as they were expanding around, got caught up in this, and apparently so did the people of this little village, which became known just very locally as the farms. It was just the locals' little name for it.
Okay.
And they built a palisade around it, just similar to the bigger town of Hatfield to the south and Deerfield to the north. And one of the houses was fortified, according to the town records, the Hatfield town records. And during 1704, there was a big attack up in Deerfield.
Right, the Bloody Brook.
At the Bloody Brook. But then in 1704, during Queen Anne's War, they actually attacked the town of Deerfield and burned a lot of it down. Yeah. Took a lot of prisoners up to Cannon. It's a big famous story. Right. And there was another small village shortly after that attack. There was another small village attacked that was south of Northampton, and they totally annihilated it. It's not very well known. It was a little village called Pascomic. It was probably down around East Hampton somewhere.
Okay.
And that was totally burned to the ground. And during this time, and it's not in the records, they abandoned this little village.
You talking about the farms?
Yeah, the farms village
okay.
in the northern part of Hatfield.
Okay.
And basically, that was the little story of the farms.
Okay. So, and your sense is that they abandoned it because for fear of the Indian.
Yeah, there wasn't any
attack and
known attacks on the village.
Right.
No large scale attack.
Right.
Some people were killed in the outlying farms while they were in the fields around the village.
Right.
Well, a couple of them were killed while working in their fields, and
right.
But no big attack where they ran out of it. Apparently, it was an organized abandonment, perhaps. But it's not in the history books.
So the villagers abandoned the village at some point way back when, and then subsequent to that, the village must have somehow become a part of that land. Must have somehow become a part of Hatfield. And ultimately, over the years, was used for farming. And the assumption is that the more the land was farmed, they worked around that village, just a sense of Mother Nature and farming and whatever that more and more the village became buried. So talk to us about how you actually found what you found.
Yeah, like you mentioned in the introduction, I needed a little project, and I had read about this little village, and so I started just searching the fields around the Brad Street area, looking for any remnants of it. Generally, you can find something, unless it was built right on top of. And at first, after some unsuccessful searches, that's what I thought. Maybe it was just underneath the little.
Right.
And
so how much of a search was this? I mean, the farmland off of
that's a lot of
farms around. That whole basin area is huge.
Yeah.
I don't know, there's thousands of acres there. I mean, was this just kind of happenstance that you came across this?
Basically, they do mention in those history books, particularly the Wells history book, that it was on a certain tract of land and a certain person's land. Okay. And so I did a little research on what property this individual owned when Wells wrote his books in the late 1800s. And that narrowed it down considerably then. At first it was more happenstance, just wandering through fields. I had a nice dog then too, and just took long walks across fields and just seeing if we'd get lucky and stumble across it. Yeah. And then one day, I have a nice little slide of it here. I was walking across this nice area here, and noticed out.
Slide of it now.
Yeah. Okay. I currently still take a little Cocker Spaniel friend of mine, my dog, out there, taking walks. We were that day, and out in one of the fields, I just noticed a bunch of rocks and bricks. And scattered across the field, sticking up out of the plowed ground. Right. And
so if one were to go out Old Farms Road at this point, which obviously now we know why that was named Old Farms Road. It was probably named after the farms. And you went straight out Old Farms Road. Is this site to the right, to the south, or to the north of Old Farms Road?
Well, the village is scattered out across that area.
Okay. Okay.
But yeah, as we were walking out across those fields, I had seen the various areas, a couple different areas that had all these bricks and rocks, and mixed in with the bricks and rocks was nails and particularly some ceramics and whatnot that through my study I could tell they were definitely from the 17th century. You know? Mm-hmm. So I knew right then that I had found the site, and then I incorporated that into my little study of it at the college, and it just kind of grew from there.
Yeah. So you were able to based on your findings and your knowledge of the research, you were able to start to map this village out a little bit, right?
Yeah. What I did then was I went and I took some grid paper. We did some measurements. We took some survey equipment out and laid some stakes out across it. Of course, after talking to all the nice landowners out there and getting permission. Mm-hmm. And we did it in the earlier spring for the most part to stay out of their way. And I mapped those concentrations out on some grid maps. And I used the metal detector a little bit here and there to look for the scatterings of nails. Where the buildings had come down, the nails got scattered by the plowing along with the bricks and whatnot. And put all these little artifact scatters. And I made a map of the village using a GIS. I have that on a nice little slide too. Mm-hmm. And it looks like you can sure see that there was 10 distinct spots where houses might have stood at the time.
And that's what the red dots.
Yeah, all the red dots are.
Okay.
And I just numbered them. That was the 10 locations.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there is a pattern of that those of us who look back at historical villages, they tended to be patterned, as you said before, the homes kind of being in the center and the farmlands to the on the outskirts.
Yeah, they built this little nucleated village where they kept their houses sort of close together, and it supposedly had a fence around the homes for protection too, a stockade, and so they kept them tight together.
Right.
But after I mapped these all out, that was well and good, but it's just surface. And the professors at UMass said, well, you got to find some sort of evidence of them under the ground now.
Right.
So my first step of doing archaeology there, now of subsurface archaeology, after mapping the concentrations, is we went and we took a couple of these little sharp stick probes.
Okay.
And it's a hard process.
Did you make these, or
this is just a handmade
this is something
object.
that's used in the archaeology?
Oh, you can buy them, but they charge quite a bit for them.
Okay.
So I just made one.
Okay.
And after seeing those bricks underneath the ground, I had assumed that there must be deposits of them. The plows were bringing them up, and from some type of structural remnants, foundations, chimney base type remnants of the houses. So I took this little sharp tip metal stick basically and just went to those little concentrations that you saw on that other slide and started just stabbing it in the ground, looking for subsurface concentrations that were down under, maybe below the plows. I only made it long enough just to get below the plow, but a little ways. It was hard enough stabbing. And after stabbing it maybe thousands of times, pretty strenuous. I'm getting a little older. It was hard on my back. But I finally did find an area that we wanted to excavate. And it seemed like instead of just scattered debris, which I had hit some of that, but it wasn't tight together. I finally found an area that was. And so we scheduled
So it was one of those 10 locations, was it?
Yes, it was at that site too.
Okay.
So me and the professors decided to went out and measured it out and laid out some grid patterns, and of course once again got permission and did a small excavation out there.
So this is by hand? You started digging with shovels?
At this point it's just shovels, trowels, sifting all the dirt. And so we scheduled a day to do it. It was a Saturday. And we were to all meet out there, and lo and behold, everybody canceled. So I was there all by myself. And we had already gridded it out, marked it out, and I had all the equipment and everything ready to go. So I did it by myself instead, because I wanted to see what was down there. Yeah. We had the nail patterns and everything, but it's just circumstantial evidence. You don't know there was anything actually there. There was a lot of skepticism, with, maybe people had thrown trash out there. I knew better because it's from the 17th century. They didn't really start fertilizing fields using rubbish from the houses and the farms until mid-18th century, in the middle, right before the Rev period, Revolutionary War. Yeah. Almost 100 years later. I personally knew that these were house locations, or at least I had a really strong feeling about it. But I had to prove it to everybody, so that's what I did. Right. And so we did an excavation here, and
the slide on the excavation.
So, and it turned out to be a hand-dug well, and it was surprising, because it started out when we first, there was a layer of rock debris over it, but as we removed it and went down in, it turned out to be a regular hand-dug well. And we found a few artifacts down in the well that helped date it, and that was helpful.
Now, how far below the ground was this, Randy?
About maybe 1.5 feet.
That's all?
The surface of it. Now, it probably, I only went down a total of about 2.5, 3 feet, just to expose the very top of it. Right. And stopped. That was, it was late. It was in November, and it was real cold. It was getting to get real cold. Sure. They were calling for a snowstorm that evening, and the first one of the season. So I ran home, got a little cup of coffee, and got my doggy.
Got warmed up and headed back.
Yep, and we headed back, and
okay.
And I had to, eventually, I took some photographs and whatnot, and had to get it filled in.
That's true.
So I was hoping I'd have a little help from my little dog there to help filling it in, but he didn't really want to help. He just dug around a little. But
that must have been really exciting when you discovered this. I mean, you had to really be excited about that.
Yeah, the well, it was actually a surprise. I didn't know actually if it might be a pile of cement blocks from a shed that was out there that I stabbed into with that little stabber. So it was a very welcome surprise. I was actually relieved and excited about it at the same time. Yes. Yeah. So.
So what happened after? Now you're all excited, and you've got you had to cover that back up. That's what you said, right? Because the farmers were about ready to start harrowing the fields. So you had to.
Yeah, I agreed to have it filled in by the end of that evening, pretty much. It was just supposed to be a quick look-see, put it back together, and
but you
not leave a big hole in the field in case, you don't want people that might have fallen in it or something. It wasn't too far off that little road, and so it was all filled in. Yeah. And at least then I took it to the results to the professors, and we discussed it. And the next phase of the research, during this fall, that same fall when I did that excavation, we had put in for a couple of small grants to do geophysics out there, and that's some very expensive process where you hire somebody to bring out some pretty expensive equipment, and the equipment can kind of see under the ground, and like with ground penetrating radar, similar, and I won a couple of small grants for that, and so we hired somebody to come out, and I have a slide of him here using a ground penetrating radar unit over the area, and so. The grants were fairly small, so we could only do a couple of small areas of it.
Right.
And
so, did you focus on the 10 sites that you had identified, or did you have to select 2 or 3 of those, or?
Yeah, we picked out a couple of the better ones, ones that I had already felt. During that process, I already had felt more debris at a couple of the other areas, and we wanted to see how these machines picked up that debris and maybe would go deeper than that little probe would go, and see what is down there. Some of these machines have had a good record of success at picking out foundations, and it actually makes images, and you can see the outlines of the foundations and whatnot. But after 2 of these little events, we didn't really have too much success. I have another slide that shows the images. There's one of the GPR images. It sort of shows the cellar hole and the magnetometer.
That's the one on the upper left?
Yeah, in the upper left-hand corner, you can see the remnants of a cellar hole there. And that was about the best image. And we did some magnetometry there, and in the right-hand image, it just shows the brick, which is exactly where I had already found it with my little probe. And then
what's just curious? What's the size on the upper left? What's the size of that?
It's
hole?
10 by 20
feet.
Yes, 10 by 20 feet.
Okay.
And
all right.
So we took that image then, and we wanted to do an excavation to see how well these machines were working.
Okay.
So what we ended up doing, here's another nice little slide. The magnetometry, I'd like to show this to some people. It didn't do too well at finding a lot of the remnants of the house, just little bits and pieces, but it found an old irrigation line out there very well. And it spreads across the whole site, and it showed that really almost too well. And it kind of drowned, the magnetometry was drowned out by these large magnetic signals from these pipes. So that didn't work too well. So we stuck with the GPR. And
so you said that you found this irrigation line.
Yeah.
What were the irrigating? Was this irrigation for their gardens, or was this irrigation? Were they irrigating their lawns? Was this? I mean, this irrigation line was in the middle of the village.
Yes,
I assume, right?
It was put in apparently in the early 1900s, and used up into the 40s and 50s. And actually, the current farm, they don't even know that it's. They didn't even know it was still there. It had it had stopped being used.
Okay, so this irrigation line wasn't part of the original settlement. It was
no. It was actually a big steel line that runs right through, and was put in to irrigate the fields at a much later date. Okay. So those lines, it disrupted when they put them in. Probably disrupted a few of the cellar holes, but it also disrupted all the equipment that we used out there. And so that was kind of significant. And most of the equipment couldn't be used because of this. Okay. At least anything that measures magnetic interferences. Okay. They were hoping to pick up some type of magnetic changes in the soil.
Sure. Yeah.
But, so what we ended up doing, it was we went to excavation a little bit, and I had a few members of the field school come out in 2009. The University of Massachusetts has a little summer field school every summer. And some of the students came with me down to Old Farms at the time. That's when I first started graduate school. And I headed some of these excavations. It wasn't a lot. We only dug a few small holes. And we did the Robert Bardwell lot, who has ties here in town.
Obviously, okay. There's another name that
Robert Bardwell
jives with current names,
had one of the lots out there. And we ended up finding a little we found some neat artifacts there. We dug into what we thought was a cellar, and that was shown on that ground penetrating radar. And we found some really nice ceramics there. At the top there, you can see some early Westerwald. I just photographed some of the 1600s materials, and some pipes. And one of the pipes was marked. It's just a fragment. Everything's busted up pretty much. There wasn't anything whole found.
So on the lower right there, this is one of the, it was marked by one of the makers.
Yeah, we looked up that maker's name, and that fellow made pipes in England in the late 16s and early 17s. So it really helps date the site, these ceramics. And, and there's a few other artifacts we found there that are quite interesting. Was the little buckles there at the top. They came off of horses.
Okay.
Or they were for horses. It's called a spur strap buckle, and it actually helps strap the spur on to a boot.
Okay.
So that shows that they had horses out there at the Bardwell lot instead of just oxen. So they were, that was a pretty neat little find. And the glass, there was some window glass found down in, and that's at the bottom. They aren't very big fragments. They're only, an inch or two square. But it showed that they had windows in the house, because it's a very distinct type of glass. They only made that type of glass in the 1600s. And it shows that the Bardwells had windows in their house, which was very unusual at the time. They generally only put like a wax paper over
the opening,
just to keep, I guess, bugs out and dirt from blowing in the windows and whatnot.
Right.
And but the Bardwells had some real glass. So, that's pretty interesting. And what we ended up finding about the house, it was a new way of more economically looking for these cellars. And that was the most important find there was the actual cellar, because we didn't know we had a cellar at the time.
Right.
We were looking more for a foundation. So what the cellar was just a square hole in the ground that was filled with odd dirt, and it was underneath just a portion of the house.
Okay.
And it was usually only under half of the house.
Okay.
So what I ended up doing was using this other little probe.
Did they use the cellars for storing vegetables and things as well? Like we've heard about people doing over the course of time. The vegetable storage cellars.
Yeah, that was probably one of the main functions of it, was to store food.
Okay.
And what we had noticed with this cellar is that most of the cellars that are in the archaeological literature were generally on the small and shallow side. Maybe 6 by 8 would have even been considered large and only 2 to 3 foot deep. They were just small crawl spaces that they would store some food.
Okay.
Whereas this Bardwell cellar, we ended up measuring it out by taking another little handheld tool. It's just a metal tube. You push it in the ground, and it fills up with soil, and you do several of them. You put handle extensions in and keep going down deeper in the dirt, and you can read what the different soils look like.
Yeah.
And at the top, of course, you have like a plow zone, and then as you get down further, most of the soils develop in distinct layers. And the layers, unless they're disturbed, are all the same all the way across the field until somebody came along and did something like these cellars, dug a hole, and it was filled in with this darker, odd-looking dirt, different deposits. So if you take this probe and go over it in a distinct patterning, you can actually get a general idea of the size and depth of these cellars.
Okay.
So what we found that taught me something after this dig was I armed myself and a few helpers, and we did a very extensive probing of the village area, particularly around all those original scatters we took, and we found evidence of these types of cellars at each and one of those 10 house lots.
Really?
So this past summer, which brings us up to more modern time here with the investigations of the village, I wanted to investigate some more of these cellars, but in a different way. Rather than try to excavate down through all these cellars like we did, I wanted to expose the surface of the cellar, that stain that we're observing, that box you could see under there. You can actually, underneath the plow zone, you can see that square cellar stain. And what that
Now,
previous
the stain you're referring to is that change in the composition of the ground, the dirt.
yes.
Okay, all right. Where do you think that dirt came from? You say that the cellars were filled with a different kind of dirt, obviously one that changed in color and texture and whatever. Where did that dirt come from?
That's an interesting question because, and a very good question, because in the 17th century, people didn't dig pits to throw away their garbage and the ashes from the fireplace. They generally just threw it all around right outside the house.
Okay. And
apparently, from other investigations that we've done, that this material, after the houses were abandoned, and the area was flooded, it's low, would wash into the hole and help fill it up. So the ash and charcoal debris from the fireplaces kept from the surrounding ground must have washed it in because it's just, you can see as we dug down into the Bardwell cellar, you could see the charcoal mixed in. It would mix in with the field soils and make it a lot darker, and it was a richer soil from
almost
like
a compost
garbage.
taking place over
like you
the
put
years.
in your garden.
Yeah.
And it was blended in with chunks of animal bone from their butchering and things like that.
Okay. Yeah.
And remnants of the house too. The cellar was filled as the house fell down. There was parts of the chimneys and bricks
would collect in the cellar.
Foundation rocks, and everything was tossed into this hole. And then another tidbit that I had found down in Forbes Library are the Judd manuscripts. Sylvester Judd, a big historian from Hadley, he had some handwritten notes, volumes and volumes of them. And there was a small paragraph in those handwritten notes that he had mentioned seeing these cellar holes. And at one time, you could still see all the apple trees still growing up in brush around these cellar holes. And it was called Old Orchard, and people went there to pick apples from time to time. It must have been remnants of the apple trees from the original settlers. That was a common practice. There must have been old apple trees still growing around this area, and it was allowed to grow up brushy. And apparently when later farmers bought this land, they wanted to eliminate this. The cellar holes in the brush, apparently at some point, somebody finished off and filled in the rest of the cellars, and probably rather than dragging soils out there, and wagon loads of dirt, they just shoveled in from the surrounding area, which once again would be those dark soils.
Okay.
So what I did the next summer was embarked on trying to find more of these cellars and map them out, and I had talked to the landowners on what we could do out there this summer. And due to the crops that were getting ready to get planted out there, I got permission to do what I wanted over a certain section of it, but I had to be done by September 1st because they were going to sterilize the ground because a certain crop, a sensitive crop, was getting put in there, and I wouldn't be allowed to pretty much do any more digging there for 3 years. And I wanted to get I would, in 3 years' time is a long time. I'm hoping to have my dissertation written by then. And I needed the data and more work done. And so,
So this was
quick as I could.
Or last year? Last summer?
This was just this past summer, yes.
This past summer,
This past summer.
Okay.
And so I created another little map, which you can see here. Site 3 was where we did, there in the upper hand, Site 3 is where we did our 2009 excavation. That's the Bardwell.
That's the Bardwell, yeah.
And you can see, it's sort of a culmination, this little map, of the cellar holes that we found and the names of all the villagers that lived there.
Now, where'd you come up with the names? How did you come up with the names for the villagers?
Yeah, well, the history books do mention them, but they don't mention the exact lots.
Okay.
And I neglected that a little earlier. I had wanted to mention, I did find another old document that it's the original land document from 1689 that has all these.
The organizers of this
Yeah, the people that actually
Collaborative?
bought it,
Okay.
the original 7
Okay.
purchasers.
Okay.
And I have the original 7 purchasers written
Okay.
up there,
Yep.
and it describes their each lot location, how many acres it was, how wide it was, and it also describes the center street and who bordered each side. So I got to create this nice little map of the village. And
Okay, just curious. What for example, I don't know if each of the lots were equal. Maybe they weren't, depending on how much each person was willing to contribute. But like the Bardwell lot, do you have any idea how many acres that piece was?
yeah, it was exactly 5 acres.
5. And were they all 5, or based on your research, or?
All but number 9 up there. And actually, the only lots that were on the 1689 document was 3, 5, 7, and 4, 6, 8, and 10. Those 7 lots. They were the 7 original purchasers. Okay. The other 1, 2, and 9, those particular lots were sold at a little bit later date. Nathaniel Dickinson, John Billings, and David Grades must have bought into that a little bit later. But those records, and even Wells lamented that those records are all gone, that they could not find any remnant. I just found some land deeds that mentions these folk buying into it in a different set of records.
So this is like one of the first subdivisions in the town of Hatfield.
Yeah, there you go.
Of course, by the time this was done now, the town had actually been established, correct? 1670. This was when was this collaborative formed, and this was built, what, 1680 something?
Yeah, they started moving in 1687, 88.
Okay, so not...
It was probably fairly well established.
Okay. Yeah.
And then in the mid 1690s, these other folks started moving into the...
Yeah.
It was growing, and it wasn't really probably a recognized town of any. It was probably just a village inside the town. They went to when they went to their church meetings, they went into Hatfield.
They came into the center of town.
They didn't have their own minister or anything. It might have gotten to that point if it was allowed to keep growing, and because it's happened. That's the way towns grew, and then they succeed from their starting town. But it was abandoned too quickly.
Yeah, yeah. So at some point they decided it was time to. It's interesting that you'd get that number of people with that size village, with those size plots, if you will, with the infrastructure that they had to build and the stockade and everything else, that all of a sudden they decided that it was time to abandon this place. There must have really been at very high risk for something. And between the Native Americans and maybe flooding, maybe the river itself was telling them to move.
Even with some of the excavations, it's short. Flooding definitely was. There's a lot of flooding did take place in that area.
Yeah.
And it perhaps when they were hiding for safety, and when the structures, and were still planning on moving back, perhaps that maybe some floods hit it, and they got a little dilapidated, and they just decided when they wanted to move back into the area, when they started expanding out that way again, they all built on higher ground.
Yeah.
And that just became farmland.
Yeah.
But then over the summer, we decided we wanted to try to expose. And what we did was expose like 7 of those houses.
Okay.
And the ones that were going to be, and so we dug these trenches, removed a lot of the topsoil off of them. Yeah. And you can see sort of there the stain.
Yeah.
That's what the stain would look like. That was the actual cellars. And on the next one, that's the corners. Those big long trenches got to be too time consuming, so what we tried to do was just do some of the corners on some of them, because we had so many to do, and we only had, now we're out, by this time I was down to like 4 weeks. So we really tried to hurry with it, and we exposed all the cellars. Yeah. And then we wanted to do an excavation unit down in the corner of each one of these cellar units.
Okay.
Right. And we wanted to, what we were really after was that'll definitely place a house being at each site, and we wanted to see if there was any remnants of the foundations like there was at the Bardwell lot at these other 7 houses. So This was another one of them. And this is the Gunn lot in the middle of the village. What we always thought might have been the fortified house, maybe. It seems to be more solidly built. But that was a large cellar. And we excavated parts of it, and you can definitely see where there is remnants of we started getting to where the chimney probably fell down. We found that area and the cellar stains on each side. Right. It was probably about 12 by 20 feet, that cellar. So that was a good sized cellar.
So how again, I'm going to ask the question, Randy, how deep is that from the surface of the?
To expose those cellars, we had to remove the entire plow zone and a little bit past, just to expose the surface of the cellar stains.
Right.
And about 15 inches.
Okay, so the cellar surface, foundation surface, if you will, was about 15 inches below, and then you've got the depth of the cellar, so you're down, what, a couple of feet anyway?
Yeah, so then we would pick, and what we did there, you can see a little red box where there's a 1. We excavated that then, and then we did one on the other side also at this particular unit at 2. And we actually excavated down and to see what was down there. And what we found at 1 was a nice foundation.
Okay.
And we found a foundation and part of the hearth base, the chimney base. And then on the other side, it's hard to see, but we actually found the remnants of a wooden staircase, still preserved, that went down into the basement. So what this was really showing is that it appears that nearly each one of these has remnants of the building still down there, which is a lot more than what we had thought.
And was this the Gunn lot?
Yeah, that was that same lot right there.
So you say that, they had more than a crawl space then, if they had a staircase going down into the basement.
Yeah, that's what
we were
trying to.
So it must have been a fairly substantial structure, like
that's what we've been trying to figure out, and discussing it with various real professional archaeologists, people that have been in the business a long time, and historians, that they thought that the people out at Old Farms were probably involved in some more economic activity with the markets rather than just the home economy. Okay. That they were growing things out at their farm and putting them in their basements for market.
Okay.
And preserving them down there, and this was for a profit-making situation.
A little bit of economy, capital, right? Yep.
So at some of the other lots, we on another slide here, we actually found the remnants of a brick fireplace down in the basement, which is very unusual. And the fireplace, generally, we were told, it wasn't built in the basement. So this might have been maybe started out as a quickie house where they just dug into the ground and put a quick roof on it and put the fireplace in there with a chimney. And maybe it wasn't even at least it might have started out that way. Right. It might have been a temporary house. Yeah. And then at another house we found, apparently they built a lot of these in a lot of different fashions. We actually could see where there was a post mold, the photo on the right side, where they surrounded the cellar with poles and probably nailed boards up onto the side of it and had it lined with wood. And some of that was preserved in that particular. We didn't have a lot of time to. We only did a couple small holes here and there, but at each one we found some really interesting things. Yeah.
So we've got a couple of artifacts that you've actually found here that we can actually show people in addition to the slides. Now, where were these items found in the same lot?
What we found was some really neat old 17th century spoons. They're very distinct. It's called a seal top spoon, and we found them at the Gunn lot that we were discussing. Okay. And they're quite ancient, museum quality pieces, in which they will be probably in the local museum at some point. They're not going to. Yeah.
But they are quite ornate too. It's interesting. I don't know if you guys can see the tip of the handle but there is a design. They were forged somehow with a.
Mike, hold
Yeah.
it. Hold it steady.
Okay. I'm pointing to this area right here where there is. It's more than just a flat handle. So I don't know. It's interesting that.
Yeah, they were made in Europe.
Whether that was their day-to-day utensil or whether that was something that was a special occasion utensil.
These spoons were pretty important to the people back then. That was like one of their most important items was a spoon. Most of their food was in like a soup material.
Yeah.
And apparently, there's a lot of stories about the early spoons. The spoon was one of their most cherished possessions, and poor people supposedly had, the poorest just had a wooden spoon, and people more in the middle had brass spoons, and rich people had silver spoons.
Right. What's this metal?
It's a brass material.
brass?
They call it Latin. It's a type
Okay.
type of brass,
Yeah.
and some of them, and you won't be able to see it on the camera, but this one has it needs some cleaning yet. It's pretty dirty, and it has a maker's stamp on it, which
That's what I was looking for in the other one.
this one, the larger one there doesn't. But this one has a maker's stamp, and we'll be able to clean it up and find out where it was made.
Yeah, interesting.
And the axe was actually down, and this one I cleaned up a little using an electrolysis unit. It's a definite axe from the late 1600s.
Randy, or Mike, can you hold it?
Pretty distinct axe. And they only made those maybe 30, 40 years, so it's fairly distinct. It was between the early pole axe that like the very early axe from the more mid 1600s.
Yeah.
And earlier.
Do you think these people forged these this axe there, or was it something that they bought?
Almost, I would imagine most of this came from Europe.
Okay.
They didn't have iron forges set up yet where they were making much of their own iron yet.
Right.
So this all would have been imported, and the spoons were probably brought over with them when they first settled there. But,
And you know what? It's still pretty sharp.
yeah, he was probably upset that he left that behind. It probably got lost and covered up, and when they abandoned it, and he unlikely he would have liked leaving that behind. But
Yeah. It's
the spoons, they're a little broke up. I don't know if they just got lost during the. But anyways.
Yeah. So where are you at now, Randy, with all this? I mean, you've discovered lots of cellars. You've done some digging in more depth. You've discovered some artifacts, and I assume because of the limited amount of time you had to fill in all this discovery and cover it up.
Yeah, that was a sad day because we did so much work to get it all.
Yeah. But you've got enough information to complete your what you need to complete for your PhD.
What I'm trying to do is, we got 7 of the houses done now. We still have the other 3. I'd like to do a minimal amount of work there, and then do a lot more historical research and piece this together further. And then we also, like we did last summer, want to get some outside involvement a little bit. They call it community archeology, and I wanted to just share it with that a little bit.
Yeah, real quick, we're getting short for time.
We had the local Boy Scouts come out last summer.
Oh, good.
Which was very helping them earn a merit badge,
Right.
and they came out and did some work at the site, and we had a couple groups from the local historical society come out and do some digging there. That was really interesting. Just helping and showing them how we do archaeology and what I was doing there, and they were very enthusiastic. It was whole families.
It's great exposure for any of them who might have an archaeologist bent, if you will, with inherent within them that this kind of activity helps to bring that out. But that's great. That's great. You get the community involved.
It was fun getting.
And hopefully you get them to help you going forward if you have to uncover this dig again to do more research and then cover it over each and every year. But I'm going to have to wrap up. We're running out of time. Randy, I want to thank Randy Daum for being here, highlighting his discovery of a village in the northern end of Hatfield. Thanks everyone for watching. Watch Hatfield Currents on hatfieldtv.pegcentral.com 24/7. Otherwise, it's on Channel 15 13 times a week. I guess that's it for us now. I'm Mike Cahill. Till next time, watch yourself, Hatfield.